This article haunts my dreams. Not because I don't like Demon Slayer, I actually really enjoyed the manga. Not because of the inaccuracies in assessing manga take-up-on sales versus Western trades and floppies on the market. Benny from Comicstorian did a great video on that in the past. No, it's because of the chuds and reactionary weebs on the internet who believe that manga is inherently superior to Western comics. That Western comics need to try and be more like manga for them to succeed. To that I say, where the hell have you been the past few decades? Where titans like Tokyo Pop rose and fell, where webcomics with generic anime art styles flooded the market, where Marvel and DC tried capitalizing on these trends to mix results back when they were still new and hip in the West. Do these people even care about Western comics or comics as an artistic medium? Probably not. Me though, I'm very interested in the history and general changes throughout the industry when manga first became an export in the West, how that directly influenced creators and companies, leading to some excellent work by a few key players. So that's what I'm gonna talk about. This won't be a complete history of every single anime or manga-inspired comic book from the United States, but rather a crash course on the evolution of book distribution and manga-inspired titles throughout the years. Something that I don't see a lot of people talking about and want to personally change.
For your health!
With all that preamble out of the way, let's start at what I assume to be the beginning.
Now watch this drive.
No, not the 50s when the Adventures of Superman serial was so popular in Japan that Speed Racer creator Tatsuo Yoshida developed the first Superman manga. Or the 60s when Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy exploded in popularity and became synonymous with Japanese culture. Rather, we go to a much more interesting period in history. One I don't see a lot of love for. The 70s. A tumultuous decade to be sure, but an artistically important one for the medium across the globe. In Japan, mangaka like Ryoichi Ikegami and Ryoko Ikeda were pushing the envelope with stories that took Western concepts and characters and attempted to not only reinvent them, but also set a standard for future creators in the field. Before this point, the biggest American-Japanese collaboration was the Jiro Kawada Batman manga from 1966 to 1967. Now stuff like Spider-Man, Rose of Versailles, and the works of Shotaro Ishinomori were openly showing their Western influences. In the United States, we were transitioning from the Silver Age to the Bronze Age, the Comics Code Authority becoming less stringent in its overview of adult subject matter in mainstream comic book work. That's something I want to stress especially. The Comics Code Authority permanently delayed the American comic book market's artistic development outside of two key genres: superheroes and funny animal comics. Now with the code becoming more lax, creators could attempt to explore more nuanced stories and characters without fear of being told their work wasn't fit to print. At the same time, however, the entertainment industry was trying to capitalize on the recent civil rights movement, exploring the burgeoning market of non-white consumers in the country at large, comics being no exception. This resulted in mixed attempts at social commentary, most famously Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil's Hard-Traveling Heroes, where the slew of characters inspired by blaxploitation or kung fu flicks such as Shang-Chi, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Sunfire, and etc. and etc. Japanese influence did creep into the Western comic book lexicon, but it was more appropriating set dressing and vaguely Eastern concepts than anything else. This would start to change going into the 80s with the birth of licensing, Gold Key publishing an English version of Kagaku Ninja Tai Gatchaman as War of the Planets, while Marvel licensed several mecha from different anime franchises for their comic Shogun Warriors, a canonical Marvel Universe story that is sadly, like Rom the Space Knight and Micronauts before them, no longer referenced. These two comics, while a footnote in greater comic book history, are important to note for us as they set the general media's tone for the growing underground niche of anime and manga. A period of time where fan subs were put on VHS tapes and conventions were in small hotel ballrooms instead of giant convention centers. Viz Communications, later known as Viz Media, would first release titles at first with pages flipped in 1987, while the manga Akira would inevitably be translated and released in the United States during 1988 by Studio Proteus, both importers subsequently changing the West's perception of Japanese pop culture with Proteus's subsequent releases like Ghost in the Shell and Nausicaa's manga, before snowballing into outright licensing properties for Western iterations. In particular, the rights to make comics using the characters of Haruka Takachiyo's Dirty Pair for 3 miniseries written and drawn by Studio Proteus founder Torrin Smith and Adam Warren, the creator and artist of softcore porn superhero series Empowered. These 3 minis would be published through Eclipse Comics, the first creator-owned and oriented indie publication before the Image Revolution, aiming to sell its work in the recently minted direct market. And judging by the letter columns that were printed at the end of most issues in the original 3 minis, it certainly struck a chord with both casual comic book fans as well as die-hard otaku from the period looking for their graphic fix. Smith and Warren were given this opportunity around the same time they were attending the Joe Kubert School of Art in Dover, New Jersey, Smith having access to VHS tapes of the Dirty Pair anime series, which only debuted a few years earlier. While the venture seemed impossible, Warren really wanted to do his own version of the characters and eventually not only got the rights to license Dirty Pair for the United States, but even show off designs for approval to Takachiyo in Japan. Adam Warren, despite my mixed feelings on his own writing ability and general sense of humor, paints a picture of a slightly more violent and overtly sexual duo of Kei and Yuri as they travel the galaxy causing trouble for criminals and subsequently the 3WA. While I'm not the most well-versed person in the Dirty Pair franchise, the fact that this not only exists but became successful enough to warrant 3 black and white miniseries is a testament to the franchise's popularity, but also the strange middle ground of Japanese characters being written and drawn with American sensibilities. Torrance Smith would eventually step away from the project and Studio Proteus altogether, the license changing hands from Eclipse to Dark Horse. That of course didn't stop Adam Warren from continuing his love for the series, producing multiple minis from the 90s all the way to 2002. And by reading these series in order, you can track the changes in Adam Warren's art style, evolving past the pseudo-anime inspired look of the original black and white mini into the vibrantly colored, experimentally drawn, big-lipped finale that, while not my cup of tea creatively, shows Warren's talents in the medium in spite of my misgivings. Though the Western Dirty Pair comic wasn't the first Amera manga, as it were. The first Western comic book I feel truly embodies and encapsulates the American weeaboo experience, especially during the 80s, was, of course, Ninja High School.
Oh, dear God, no!
Created by first-generation Taiwanese-American artist Ben Dunn during 1987, Ninja High School was the result of Ben's exposure to manga when visiting his family back in Taiwan before graduating high school in Texas. Creating the small pub known as Antarctic Press and publishing comics anthology and anime fandom rag Mangazine in 1984 with future collaborator Fred Perry, Mangazine would last well into the 2000s before finally ceasing publication. Dunn's goal was to create more manga-style comics in the Western sphere despite its incredibly niche appeal at the time. Ninja High School is the culmination of not only Ben's hard work as a self-employed cartoonist, but also a celebration of everything he loves in pop culture, manga or otherwise. Ninja High School, at least at first, follows the story of high school junior Jeremy Feeple. Jeremy's mother was raised by the Ichinohe clan, an esteemed bloodline of ninja who remained dominant in Japan into the modern era. However, with a need for the bloodline to continue, the clan's head and Jeremy's adopted grandfather Kudasai. Kudasai. Please. Ichinohe. What, the fucking prefecture? Are you trying to say one field? One field, please! I digress. Jeremy's grandpa decides that in order to continue the bloodline, Jeremy must marry the overcompetent and overqualified ninja and blood descendant of Kudasai, Ichikun, also known as Ichiku to most of the cast. Ichikun is not happy that she has to marry Jeremy to gain rule over the clan, but goes along with it in the hopes of either divorcing or outright killing Jeremy when their wedding is over. So, Ichikun is sent all the way to Quagmire, Ohio, to live with Jeremy's family until their wedding finally happens.
Giggity.
However, Ichikun unwittingly alerts her childhood friend Rival-san Lendo to her family's plans, and is followed there by Lendo and his daddy's megacorp money. This all sounds well and good, and then you throw in a furry! Because fuck you, why not? The Seleucian Empire of skunk humans is in need of Earth to join the intergalactic conglomerate of races. How will they do this? Simple! Marrying off their princess Azrael from Undertale to the primest specimen possible in order to represent a union between races. Who do they choose? They choose Jeremy, of course. I swear this is starting to read more like Mike and Melissa in the 80s. Azrael is forced to remove all of her fur and noticeably animal elements except for her ears and crash lands at Quagmire High School to fight for Jeremy's affection. That's the plot of the first 3-issue miniseries, and it's a lot to say the least. Dunn has gone on record saying Ninja High School was primarily inspired by Urusei Yatsura, and you can see that influence of Rumiko Takahashi in how he draws his principal characters and their expressions. While it does border a teensy bit on plagiarism for a comic that came out over 3 decades ago, the art really holds up. The amount of detail Dunn squeezes out of his pencils matches the manga aesthetic of his influences while also displaying his clear Western roots. The inking is nothing to sniff at either, further stressing that contrast between styles Dunn is so clear on exploring. It's meant to look like a Western comic was invaded by a manga, and at times I can say he's achieved that despite his verbose, handwritten dialogue. While the miniseries ends with everyone being friends and Lendo being stuck in Quagmire alongside the girls as punishment for wasting all of his father's resources on a failed kidnapping, the series doesn't end there. In fact, in 1988, it returned for regular serialization, immediately retconning Jeremy's family into being cursed by a witch during the 18th century, the demon attached to him being responsible for all the bad luck every character we've met has faced in the prior 3 issues. Also, Supergirl is there. And she's an android. This comic has no breaks. It continued and continues to spin its wheels to this very day, with multiple spin-offs and pin-up issues and reboots to keep the formula fresh for the Western comic audience. Dunn stepped in and out of the project as he pleased, only focusing on visuals when he was involved, as he released other Amerimanga like Warrior Nun Aurelia, which inevitably got a live-action Netflix series. This, as well as his inevitable contributions to Marvel, are what put Ben Dunn and Antarctic Press on the map. An understanding that there was not only fandom for anime manga way back in the 80s, but also this belief that, hey, manga is pretty cool. We should have more manga. Or stuff like it, at least. The 90s. While the first major anime convention with corporate backing happened in 1991, the Western fandom was still growing. The Versus series was birthed, ushering in a slew of Marvel fans hooked on Bendis's beautiful manga-inspired renditions of classic comic book characters. Various dubbing studios were bringing shows like Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z to English-speaking countries with occasional changes in characterization for the sake of localization. This is what led to the Deke dub of Sailor Moon, Ocean's dub of Dragon Ball before changing hands to Saban, and eventually Funimation, and most importantly to this particular essay, a wider influx of manga translations hitting bookstore shelves from Viz Media, which they were calling graphic novels to avoid confusion with the typical floppy format still at play. That would be a smart move given the inevitable speculator bubble popping and nearly destroying the Western comic book industry as a whole, but I digress. Manga influence was clearly there in the 90s, both at Image if Jim Lee's guest artists on Gen 13 were anything to go by, as well as the indie scene with the inevitable creation of Tokyo Pop in 1997, another manga localizer and publisher that would first try emulating the Japanese manga magazine style of distribution with their magazine Smile, before inevitably venturing into the Amerimanga aesthetic in the early to mid-2000s with The Rising Stars of Manga. However, what I really want to talk about is a cultural oddity that's still being discussed to this day in some circles. One that didn't have the permissions Torrin Smith and Adam Warren had for Dirty Pair, or the justification of fair use parody law like Ben Dunn. Instead, it sits firmly in the plagiarism camp as a one-issue oddity that will never, ever be continued. Diesel, written and drawn by Joe Weltjens, is Antarctic Press's redheaded stepchild they refused to acknowledge after its release in 1997. I assume that's due to the fact that Weltjens worked his way up after this to become Antarctic Press's editor-in-chief. What the fuck? Though it may be harsh to say that it's out-and-out plagiarism, Weltjens went on record to say that after watching a certain 10-ish episode OVA series of a specific shonen manga that was popular in Japan, he was inspired to use the same concepts to bring more attention to that manga. But, you know, they couldn't license it. Antarctic Press was an original comic book publisher. Instead, Weltjens opted for a more loose approach of adaptation. He would use the powers and scenarios of the series he watched to make an action-packed first issue, setting up a mystery that could follow through with readers if they continued to buy more issues. Quite the justification for ripping off Hirohiko Araki's magnum opus, but sure, why not? Diesel is weird as a single-issue comic. It isn't bad by any means, but its usage of JoJo iconography and especially character designs is counteracted by its aggressively 90s superhero-inspired art style. Meta Hammer is no Star Platinum, John Diesel is certainly no Jotaro. And if you told me that Dio Brando, one of the most iconic villains in Shonen Jump's history, would be named Mr. Botha in an American adaptation, I'd question my own sanity. Botha D! Oh god, not the face! In a way, I kind of want to follow up to Diesel, but in the same morbid sense that I want to see more of Ninja High School. A form of masochistic cringe whose creators are clearly passionate about the work they do. It's just not always the best, especially in this case. I don't want to close out the 90s on a negative note, because despite the commonly held conceit that the 90s was the dark age of comics before reaching the modern era, some beautifully illustrated and occasionally compelling comics came from this decade. Garth Ennis's Preacher, Jeff Smith's Bone, Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's From Hell, and on the topic of this current essay, Joe Madureira's Battle Chasers. Published originally through the creator-owned Wildstorm imprint Cliffhanger, back when it was bought out by DC Comics in 1998, before decades later being moved to Image Comics proper. Battle Chasers, aesthetically, is what would happen if Arcane, or God forbid League of Legends itself, was made back in the 90s instead of the edge of the aughts. a world where kings rule the masses with magic-enhanced weaponry, skinwalkers and warlocks kill for coin, and where great heroes go missing when their war is finally over. One of these heroes, the former general of King Veneer's armies known as Aramis, has seemingly disappeared without a trace, leaving behind his daughter Gully to live in the wilderness before being come upon by would-be furry assassins. Forced to leave home with a magic locked box containing Aramis's mystical gauntlets, she's saved by the ancient war golem known as Calibretto and soon meets her mage mentor, the nigh immortal Nolan. Across the way is Garrison, a former friend and ally of Aramis who lost his wife due to mysterious circumstances and is thrust back into battle at the urge of Red Monica, a childhood friend turned bounty hunter who's been given a job to break a terrorist out of the enchanted prison above the capital city known as Skyhold. All 5 of these characters will cross paths with one another in the heat of battle, each fighting for their own reasons as a conspiracy brews below the surface of King Veneer's castle. That's the most I can give you without outright spoiling the currently 12-issue run. It's a mix of shonen manga influence, with Gully clearly being a plucky chosen one with daddy issues, while also pulling on JRPGs like Final Fantasy VI and VII for designs and general vibes. Joe Mad's pacing is really on point. While some issues are loaded with dialogue, it's never too much or loaded with fantastical gibberish. Instead, it, as well as Joe Mad's artwork, flows really well from page to page. And these fights are very solid, action happening every issue and always making you curious what exactly will come next for our disparate heroes. I'd say jump right into Battle Chasers cold and see how you feel, because I will admit there are some slight issues in character development, specifically for Gully in the latter half of the series, that I don't really enjoy, due to how it's stretched across several different issues. Why is that the case? Well, dear viewers, Battle Chasers is just as bad, if not more so, than Miura was in his later years. At first publishing an issue or two a year before ultimately going on hiatus that didn't lead to more of the actual comic, but instead a really well-made turn-based RPG using the comic as a jumping-off point. A game with an ending. Unlike the source material, which, as of June 2023, has finally continued publication with planned 3 to 4 issue story arcs. The art in issues 10 to 12 have changed hands from Joe Mad himself to Ludo Lullaby, who elevates the tale out of the 90s and into the modern era with a dash of modern manga influence. And let me tell you, despite the minor issue I had with Gully's development going into it, these few issues really make it seem like no time has passed since issue 9's hiatus. More questions are given, stakes are raised, and the fights are still thrilling from beginning to end. Like I said, jump into Battle Chasers with an open mind and be amazed by what Joe Madureira and his team were capable of creating. It's truly worth the price of admission.
Fuck you.
The aughts. This is where the anime boom really took place, and where Marvel Comics finally took notice of this anime, to a point that they made not only an imprint into the 2000s called Tsunami that was home to Nihei Suotomo's Snikt, which is just Blame but with Wolverine, as well as the perennial underdog in Marvel's lineup to this day in the form of Runaways, but also an initiative and outright alternate universe using Ben Dunn of Ninja High School fame to craft what Marvel dubbed their Mangaverse. And it's bad! Well, there's a clear difference in goals compared to the main continuity around this time, as well as plenty of artistic choices I do appreciate, like Mangaverse Spider-Man being a little dork whose uncle was killed by his cousin, the Ronin Venom. Not much is of interest beyond morbid curiosity in the excellently rendered / comedically brilliant Mangaverse Ghost Riders book, one written by Chuck Austin of all people. You know, the guy who did porn comics before writing X-Men. That Chuck Austin. The Mangaverse's lack of central identity is very apparent, trying to appropriate stereotypically Japanese-themed set dressing and designs for very simple, not particularly interesting stories. We have the Avengers, led by a mysterious millionaire, Tony Stark, who uses 4 different iron vehicles to create Ultimate Iron Man, which is just a Megazord. Neat. We also have the Fantastic Four, who wear bodysuits that give them their powers, including a big-breasted red tomboy known as Johnny Storm, who also has a potential relationship with the Thing in this universe. Oh god, I just got the chills. This universe would last until the mid-2000s, with a proper Marvel Mangaverse title starring Spider-Man, but mainly consisted of a few miniseries headed by Ben Dunn and his clearly evolved art style from Rumiko Takahashi ripoff to god-tier how to draw manga style. It was apparent that, despite the passion on display by the big two for the growing anime and manga market, baseline aesthetics weren't enough to draw in the mythical casual readers. Instead, fans of manga took to, well, manga, as well as the internet for not just anime reviews from deranged killer Trey Sessler, but also the webcomic boom taking place. Aoi House, which I previously discussed in depth, the not-so-talked-about Okashina Okashi, which stood among greats like Control-Alt-Delete and Penny Arcade as early webcomic pioneers, and perennial middle school library book whose cover still haunts my nightmares to this day like my name was Pico Fred Gallagher Largo, Mega Tokyo. Hey yo, shout out to Smack Jeeves. Sprite comics like Digimon Saviors and hand-drawn marvels like Mokepon by Holy Hand Grenade are the reason why I got into comics in the first place. Read both if you want to understand how my brain works. Okay, thanks. However, since we're in the 2000s, there's one book that stands above all others whose grimy mid-20-year-old shadow we're still trying to claw ourselves out of. One that takes manga influences just like Ben Dunn did with Ninja High School, but chooses not to appropriate any particular style or show to prop up its own story. One whose art remains at every Hot Topic, Spencer's, or Barnes & Noble, even to this day.
And right now, my work makes me sick, he tells his wife. Tintin is no longer me, and I must make a terrible effort to invent him. If Tintin continues to live, it is through a sort of artificial respiration that I must constantly keep up, and which is exhausting me. Herge. This is why Scott Pilgrim ends. If I was still doing Scott Pilgrim in 10 years, I would be dead inside.
Enjoy the first 3 episodes of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. There'll be a Q&A after.
Scott Pilgrim is almost 20 years old. Like Mirage and TMNT, O'Malley and Scott exploded into the public eye and quickly grew into one of the most recognizable names in the indie comic space, becoming a juggernaut franchise with a movie, a video game, an animated sequel series, a card game that I probably will never play. It's not hard to see why it's inspired at least some kind of adaptation. Its integration of video game iconography with shonen manga spreads and flair, its punchy and sarcastic cast of teens to mid-20-year-olds, its themes of confronting the past and coming of age no matter who you are. It's a little marvel of a series that somehow stood the test of time because, despite its target audience of tweens to young adults growing ever so older, ever so jaded with the world as it continues to spin, it's still so damn relatable to people. The older I get, the more I realize why I loved this series so much in middle school and why I love it even to this day. If you haven't read Scott Pilgrim, please take the time to do so. Warts and all, you won't regret it.
And now, the 2010s, when Naver's webtoon finally crossed from the shores of South Korea to the rest of the free world, giving a multitude of creators a platform with a unique format to upload their webcomics onto, but also access to several manhwa that were clearly influenced by the greater anime and manga world. Stuff like God of High School, Tower of God, Lookism, and all inevitably getting anime releases with memorable moments or fight choreography that elevated their status merely beyond webcomic fame. There was also Radiant, a shonen battle series created and drawn by French cartoonist Tony Valente, which inevitably got its own anime adaptation. The French are just as big of weebs, if not more so than the US, so its own market of anime-flavored content has existed over the years. However, none reached the heights Radiant has, getting its own Japanese language dub and translation for the French-made series. If you put Radiant in a box next to several other shonen manga from the period like The Promised Neverland or Jujutsu Kaisen, I wouldn't be able to tell that it's French. And that's kind of the point of where we're at as an industry. The lines blurring between legitimate Japanese made and produced manga and the birth of an era where manga once again just means comics. There's publishers now like Saturday FM, which puts black creators in the spotlight for their manga-inspired titles like Apple Black and Clock Strikers, outright calling them manga for distribution's sake. And once again, putting Apple Black in a box, it's really hard to distinguish it from its Japanese counterparts and inspirations. And that's both a great thing given the amount of material there is now, but also one that makes me sad. I miss that halfway between anime and manga that Ben Dunn, Adam Warren, and Joe Madureira capitalized on in their own work. One that wears its influences on its sleeves, but doesn't let that distract from the narrative they're telling. There's one webcomic in particular I want to touch on to round this video out that I think takes the manga influences we touched on throughout this video and meshes it perfectly with a Western art style. One that isn't delayed for years on end, and as of the time of recording, is still ongoing. Tom Parkinson Morgan's, or should I say Abaddon's, Kill 6 Billion Demons. Originally launched in 2013 on their own website before inevitably getting hardcover releases by Image Comics, Kill 6 Billion Demons is the story of Allison Ruth, a college girl who, in the midst of their first time having sex with her then-boyfriend Zayd, is whisked away in brutal fashion to a world where angels and demons are not only commonplace, but at war for the sake of the 7 Black Kings. Entrusted with a key of kings in her forehead and granted its awesome power, Allison first seeks to escape this alternate dimension with Zaid by her side before slowly but surely evolving past her initial goal, as well as the person she used to be. Kill 6 Billion Demons is one of the best looking comics I've ever read. While initially pitched as a choose-your-own-adventure comic like the original MS Paint Adventures was, it was changed to a serialized narrative, and that was to its benefit. Allison's journey from a meek sorority pick-me girl to ultra-badass Kingslayer is one I haven't quite seen in any other manga or comic. She's practically unrecognizable by the time you reach the current pages, in touch with not only godly power she was granted in this infinitely looping war for existence, but also herself and what she wants out of life. Even if that doesn't include a romantic relationship with Zaid, who was poised to be the user of the Key of Kings in this timeline before things, of course, changed. Allison isn't alone on her quest to find Zaid and a way out of this nightmarish demon world. There's White Chain, an angel cop who's desperate to find acceptance for their perceived humanoid gender, as well as Sio, a crackpot lower-ranked witch demon who eventually develops a sexual relationship with the ever-curious Allison. Filled with deep lore and philosophical ponderings from fictional swordsmen and philosophers, Kill 6 Billion Demons seeks to enlighten its own reader through these asides and generally warm character beats. While you can argue it's nothing original, that can be said with everything I've spoken about in this essay. Kill 6 Billion Demons is close to a masterwork of action and dramatic intrigue, whose battles rival and even surpass the shonen greats that inspired it. This long lineage of manga-inspired comics will continue for as long as the medium still persists. Even though manga has taken the spotlight within the past decade for the artistry its authors provide the greater world, comics are still capable of doing the exact same thing. Whether it be cheap adrenaline-fueled thrills in Battle Chasers, wartime fantastical existentialism in Kill 6 Billion Demons, harem anime-inspired shenanigans gone wrong like Ninja High School, or a not-so-traditional love story like Scott Pilgrim. And beyond just the manga-influenced comics out there, there's still plenty of wonderful indie and occasionally enrapturing work from the big two that are worth people's time. However, if you're inclined to read only manga in a world where the sequential arts is finally growing beyond country borders to make wonderful art, that's okay too. Manga may be theoretically outselling Western comics, but that doesn't mean comics aren't good anymore or haven't tried being more like manga in the past. At the end of the day, it's just a matter of creative vision, hard work, and a little bit of luck to get your work out there. And if any of these creators and their unique attempts at expanding the medium have taught you anything, it's that hard work can really pay off. Read Mokepon. It's bangers. And thank you for watching.